stand part.
Mr. Chair.
Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's my pleasure to take a call in the committee stages of the Parole Amendment Bill. I thought it would be helpful to backtrack slightly to just cover off before I come to some specific clauses that the Select Committee considered at greater length to the overall issue that this bill as a whole was seeking to tackle. The Parole Act, I guess relatively speaking, is a newish act introduced, well, it feels new to me because I remember its introduction. It probably feels very new to the Honourable Phil Goff, who was obviously the Minister in charge at the time. But the Parole Act 2002 is the bill that the act we're seeking to amend, which set out some core principles that remain unaltered in the way that the Parole Board operates. The most key of which was that the Parole Board, when considering parole for offenders, would give paramount consideration to the safety of the community. Amongst all of the other competing issues that the Parole Board considers, the number one consideration when determining the release of an offender, and indeed in determining when perhaps the board meets again to consider the release of that offender, is the safety of the community. So that continues to be the guiding principle of the Parole Board in that consideration. Having said that, the Parole Board obviously has a number of offenders that it's continually having to review to determine whether or not they have reached that threshold. The board is required under the status quo, required once every 12 months to give consideration to an offender who is eligible for parole. That's once every 12 months for general sentence, but if there is a indeterminate sentence for an offender, that is every 3 years, but the bill seeks to extend to 5 as a possibility for the Parole Board if they so choose. That, however, does mean that we have a reasonable number of Parole Board hearings. The regulatory impact statement sets out that in 2010 to 11, the board held around 5,000 parole hearings. Interesting, however, though, that and given that this bill as a whole seeks to check the efficiency of that number of hearings, interesting to, though, see that those are not all parole hearings where the potential release of an offender is considered. As the regulatory impact statement sets out, 500 are recall hearings, 200 variation of hearings, and 500 hearings where the board's only role is to set conditions because an offender has reached their statutory release date. We now know, however, that obviously with some of the additional bills that have recently been passed through the House, a statutory release date does not necessarily mean the end of supervision or necessarily the end of release now. But having deducted those hearings, roughly then you're left with 3,800 Parole Board hearings where we can assume that potentially there is consideration of an offender for release. Not all of those hearings, and we heard this at the Select Committee, and I think it's an important point to make, not all of those hearings will necessarily involve a victim. Not all of the offenders, of course, who are serving in our prisons will have a victim in the traditional sense of the word. Their victim may have been an entity, it may be white-collar crime, for instance. So not all of these hearings will involve a victim, but a number certainly do. And in considering whether or not we're using the Parole Board most efficiently, we must also consider whether we're inappropriately re-traumatising victims unnecessarily, because there simply is no prospect of an offender potentially being considered for parole. And I'm sure the Minister and the Chair will correct me if I'm wrong, that does seem to be the primary driver of this legislation. And it's hard to deny that principle when that is at the heart of this bill. But I think it is still important to note that some of these Parole Board hearings, of course, can be unattended, so not necessarily the Parole Board may make a decision that they do not require an offender to be there. That, of course, would change the nature of a Parole Board hearing from the perspective of a victim. And there are the ability to delay a Parole Board hearing, but we heard on the committee that can be litigated by an offender, and that can turn into, Mr Chair, quite a lengthy and drawn-out process, and one that is benefits no one. But, Mr Chair, I think it's also, however, critically important to note that parole board hearings are not just used by the parole board to just consider release. In fact, the parole board will often use hearings when they themselves view that an offender simply isn't ready to set down, for want of a better word, goals, milestones that they would like to see an offender achieve in order for them to be considered in the next, at the next board hearing for release. So one concern that we raised during the Select Committee over the idea of delaying, adding lengthier times in between parole board hearings was, would there be a check against the goals the parole board is setting down for an offender that they were actually occurring? Now, let me explain what I mean by that. It might be that the parole board doesn't consider an offender eligible for parole, but sets out to the prison manager that their expectation is that that offender will be enrolled in a work readiness program, or that they will undertake one of the many perhaps stopping violence programs that our prison service offers. It is not a given that because the parole board makes that request that program will be undertaken. In fact, we heard a lot of evidence to suggest that, in fact, many times the parole board would see that those milestones, although we're not using the word milestones because in the legislations we did not want to give the suggestion that if it was achieved it meant automatic release. But we heard a lot of discussion about whether or not having those specified actions set down, how we would then check that they would be completed by the prison management and ensure that they were taking place. That remains a concern. We even had a discussion as to whether or not actually we needed an alternative mechanism that wasn't the parole board, that was an independent body that did ensure that the Corrections Service were making sure that they were fulfilling some of those milestones. Some of us had an opportunity to even sit in on parole board hearings, and a prime example, I sat in on a hearing where an offender had been before the board. The board had set down a number of things they wanted completed. They had all been completed bar one. Appropriate housing had not been found for that offender. That parole board considered that offender ready for release, but because no suitable housing had been found, and of course corrections were involved in that, they refused to release that offender. Now that is not a good use of taxpayer resource to continue to imprison someone the parole board considers ready for release because there were elements of the service that just weren't being provided. So that's something we continue to have a concern about. However, the principle of the bill in terms of discretion for the board we consider sound. Allowing that extra time delay between parole board hearings we think was something we could certainly support. I want to look specifically at Clause 10, Mr Chair. In there we made an addition as a Select Committee. It said there that the board must specify a date by which an offender must be further considered for parole, and gave the ability that where the date for the next parole hearing was beyond 12 months, if corrections considered, or as the bill states, the manager of the prison, obviously because corrections doesn't run all of our prisons now, but the manager of the prison in which the offender is detained considers that all of the relevant activities have been completed, they can they can give notice to the offender that the board may consider hearing their application. So there is some discretion built into that. It is interesting in Clause 11 again we actually talk about the manager not of the department but of the prison, and no reference to the Department of Corrections. It does make you wonder whether or not this bill is in preparation for further privatisation of our prison service. So we thought that was a sensible amendment for the Select Committee to take, and as I've already said, it also in those clauses sets out relevant activities rather than milestones, because it certainly was just too misleading to claim a milestone, because it does give the impression that if an offender were to reach it, it would mean there would be some kind of automatic release. One of the other key considerations that came up as a byproduct of hearing this bill, Mr Chair, which I see my time is possibly about to expire. I'd happily take another call to expand on that issue.